You're listening to episode 106 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Amishi Jha joins us to speak about mindfulness programs in the military. Over the course of the past several years, I've heard and seen some pretty damning opinions of teaching mindfulness to military personnel, active duty or otherwise. Often there's a false dichotomy, subtly posed with contrasting images of soldiers bristling with weapons in a combat scenario, and then an image of a stately monk sitting tranquilly in meditation. Of course, you don't see the soldiers sitting calmly when they're practicing meditation, nor do you see the monk hitting a nun in full view of his community. Where I find such evidence-free criticisms failing is that they completely ignore the body of military personnel who are, to a soldier, still people. Some of these people may have found their way into service as the only way to get money for college, or to escape crushing poverty and build a life for their family. And veterans, those who may have suffered during their deployments more horribly than many of us can ever understand, aren't they people too, also deserving of some chance for equanimity? Dr. Amishi Jha has a PhD from the University of California, Davis, postdoctoral training in brain imaging at Duke University, and was a faculty member at the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. Her current post is Principal Investigator, Associate Professor of Psychology, and Director of Contemplative Neuroscience, Mindfulness Research, and Practice Initiative, University of Miami. Her research focuses on the brain bases of attention, working memory, and mindfulness-based training. With grants from the U.S. Department of Defense and several private foundations, her current projects investigate how to best promote resilience in high-stress cohorts using contemplative training techniques that strengthens the brain's attention networks. She was selected as a Science and Public Leadership Fellow by PopTech and serves on editorial review boards of Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, Frontiers in Cognitive Science, and Frontiers in Psychology. Our guest today is Amishi Jha. Amishi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I'm so glad to have you here. And for folks who are listening, this particular interview has been literally years in the making, long before even this podcast started. I'm so happy to have you with us. Let's dive right in. Amishi, tell us about your background. How did you first encounter mindfulness?
My journey to mindfulness actually comes from a way very similar to what many people experience, need. So I was a faculty member running a lab at the University of Pennsylvania. I just had my son at that point. I was pretty young in my academic professional career and was basically crippled by stress to the point where I was just going to quit. You know, after having basically made it, so to speak, got the job at the great institution, was running a successful lab. Everything outwardly looked fine, great, you know, husband, child, lab. But it was kind of crushing me. So before I quit my entire career, the idea came to me and actually was very well supported by my spouse to maybe see if I could change the way I felt before I changed uprooted our entire lives. And right before, it was right around the end of the spring semester. So I was having the summer coming up and could actually take a little bit of the space that I would need to delve into something. But right before that, Richie Davidson had come to Penn. And he gave this wonderful lecture on affective neuroscience having nothing to do with mindfulness or meditation. I mean, frankly, at that point, I think that was back in either 2002 or three. It was the early days. But I remember him describing the benefits of meditation broadly and mindfulness specifically, not by explicitly really getting into the details, but just saying that it may be an effective way by which people can go from feeling bad to feeling better, and that it would be in a person's own hands to practice meditation in order to do that. So that really got me very interested. I did not expect him to say anything about meditation. I mean, personally, just to go back a little bit, I grew up in a Hindu family, and that was just part of the landscape of my family life. My mother and father both did Mala every day, but I never thought it was something I would ever do myself. It was just sort of like this thing that they did for them. That's great, but not interested. No, thank you. I'm a scientist. Sort of very dismissive in that way. So it was a real coming together of my personal background and this professional expertise that Richie represented to me. And I got curious. So I bought my first Meditation for Beginners book by Jack Kornfield. And that summer, just committed to doing the practices. If you've ever seen that book, it's a great little gem of a book with guided practices in it. I think it's just recordings from a retreat he led. And with that commitment came a lot of benefit, practicing every single day for probably about a month and a half, 2 months, to the point where it was changing me. So that was the initial entry point into mindfulness in my personal life.
And then what spurred your interest in the scientific study of meditation?
Right. So here's the kind of cool part is that, my professional background is as a neuroscientist. And in particular, I study the brain's attention system. So how it is that we're able to focus, select, deal with distraction, both external and internal. And that's where my professional curiosity had always been for, since I was an undergrad, basically. So all of a sudden, I'm doing these practices, feeling better, understanding that the guidance that is being given for these practices is completely tied to attention, and noticing the benefits myself, and put it all together and said, oh my goodness, I could actually study this. I actually have the tools to figure out how this is happening, that quietly closing my eyes and paying attention to my breath, let's say for 15 minutes a day, is making me a better mom and definitely a more attentive spouse. That was sort of a defining moment where I wanted to make sure mindfulness had a significant portion of my kind of professional life also. And I pivoted my lab's research focus to go from just the basic mechanisms of attention, really to attention training, and in particular, the effects of mindfulness training on attention.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear that you were pre-evolved professionally to study this field.
Yeah, it was really, really fortuitous. It was sort of like combining the personal interest now with already the professional drive to pursue this with the tools and access I had to methodologies that could do it.
Terrific. Well, let's shift, speaking of pivoting, to our main topic for today. A lot of your work, at least that which I'm most familiar with, has been with active duty military. So say about how did that start? Why is that of personal interest to you?
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is, as I mentioned, the starting point of the entire journey into mindfulness for me personally came from a sense of overwhelm and pressure, performance pressure. How do you keep it all going when the demands are extremely high and when you don't want to screw up anything that you're doing because it has consequences for those that you interact with, right? So I already knew that it was effective for high stress, just from a very N of one personal experience. Like, okay, I can see how this could be useful. So part of my interest when we got to looking at it from my lab's perspective was in this high stress context. So the other piece I should say is that I had this sense that mindfulness may be useful for people that are experiencing high stress. The other thing we were learning from the laboratory work is that stress really is like kryptonite for the brain's attention system. It degrades it, depletes it, fatigues it, makes our decision-making that's based on our attention problematic and error-prone. So putting those two things together, I was interested in offering mindfulness training to high-stress high demand professions. And actually, one of our very first projects was with University of Pennsylvania medical and nursing students. They were in the same boat. High pressure scenarios, high stress, and life or death consequences if they screwed up. So already I was inclined to look at things in that way. And then I actually ended up meeting with a colleague who ended up being a longtime collaborator, Dr. Liz Stanley from Georgetown. And she was a prior active duty military service member and officer with a very strong interest from her own, again, personal journey to bring mindfulness to active duty military personnel. And it really seemed like a good partnership to try it out. So we wrote our first set of grants and successfully were able to get them, and then pursued a multi-year project to systematically try to see what happens if we offer active duty service members mindfulness training. Now, the key that was sort of interesting about this is at that time, we were many years into that point, probably 4 or 5 years, not that many compared to now, years into post 9/11 combat in the Middle East. And already we were starting to see that service members were really having compromise as a function of it, the highest rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, not only for service members themselves, but for their spouses. So the entire kind of military family unit was being impacted by the demands that our country was putting on them as a post 9/11 response. So the need was there. We were interested in bringing this to them. And to me, it seemed, and Liz as well, that just waiting for people to come back already psychologically ill and then giving them a solution was not the right strategy. Right? In the same way that we don't wait till people are injured to then say, oh, you should probably work out, right? To keep yourself physically fit. Every service member has daily physical training because they know that being physically fit helps them be best ready for what's ahead. So the model that I was interested in promoting is the notion that mindfulness training may be a way to promote resilience, in particular cognitive resilience with regard to attention, to make service members best able to handle the challenges that were going to come their way through multiple deployments.
So your work has been on pre-deployment, as you're just mentioning. Let's get them beforehand. So what was that like? What did you see as you started doing studies, and what were some of the results that you'd seen?
Right. So the thing that I wanted to find out first is what happens when people just go through a normal pre-deployment phase is not the right word, training regimen, right? So let's say it's a multi-month, let's say it's 9 to 6 months of lead up time to get ready to go for their next deployment. And in particular, what about that kind of 2 or 3 months right before they go? That's when they're learning all their mission specific skills. They're getting operationally ready. They're getting briefed on the culture, the demands, the specific nature of the mission, etc. Demands are very high. So what happens when people are just in that preparatory phase? My hunch was that just getting ready to go may itself be depleting because the demand is so high to get things ready. And, part of this came from, again, working with these medical and nursing students and undergraduates, seeing that going through a high stress period of demand, like the academic semester, actually degrades and depletes our attention just going through it. And then think about what happens at the end of that semester, for example. You've got to actually perform and do well on your final exams. And now you're not in the peak shape you need to be in to fully attend to what the demands are. If the same were true for pre-deployment soldiers, that's pretty bad, because now it's not just taking an exam, which may feel like life or death for a student. It actually could be life or death for the soldiers themselves, or definitely for the people that they're interacting with when they're deployed. So to me, it became almost a need to figure out what happens when we don't do anything at all. So we tracked that. And unfortunately, my hunch was right. There is a depletion of attention, working memory, mind wandering increases, mood and anxiety levels also increase. So the news is very bad as people are preparing to deploy in terms of their real readiness, their psychological and cognitive readiness. So the questions we were asking with mindfulness are, can we protect against this? What do we need to do to offer them training that's accessible, can accommodate the demands of their schedule, because they're already maxed out and there's not like a lot of moments in the day where they can do more stuff. But that's what I became very interested in sorting out, is the practical or applied solutions to how we can keep people best protected.
So what happened? What were the results of what you saw pre and post deployment?
So the way we went about this is to do this strategically, because think about where we are with the most accessible form of mindfulness training in our society today, MBSR, right? Mindfulness-based stress reduction. Well evaluated, strong evidence. At that point, it wasn't as strong as it even is now, but it was a good hunch that through the 25 plus years that it's been around, it's doing a good job of, in that sense, not protecting, but benefiting people, right? There's many salutary effects, as we would say. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a lot of time. 8 hours with about 2.5 hours a week. There's even a day-long retreat. If I walked into a commander's office and said, I need 40 plus hours over 8 weeks, they would slam, they'd ask me to politely leave and then because that's just not the kind of time that they had. So the way we set up the whole project was not, we have a one size fits all solution that we know works well in a civilian setting and let us do this with soldiers. It was, okay, that's going to be a range of time that we may have as one end of the continuum. In fact, we didn't go as far as 40 hours. Our longest training was 24 hours. And then we titrated down the time demands. So we had 24 hours, 16 hours, and 8 hours. So for example, the 8-hour version would be an hour a week with the trainer over 8 weeks, let's say. And what we wanted to see is not so much, is it helpful, just yes or no, but which works best? Are any of these useful? That's the first question. And then is there a difference with more time potentially resulting in bigger benefits? What we found, just to kind of cut to the chase, is that 8 hours was sufficient to actually see protective effects in soldiers' attention and working memory, which is great. I mean, if we could get it down to a number of hours that people could actually do, that was a very exciting possibility. But it mattered what we did in that 8 hours. So one of the studies we did was we compared when 8 hours of training with the trainer was mindfulness practices. So they came together, they learned a new practice out of our exercise suite. They did it with the trainer. They discussed the practice. They were assigned it for homework. Do that for 8 weeks. And then the comparison was 8 weeks, same trainer, same motivation, same framing, but in class, they spent a lot of time learning basically information, or what we call didactic content. How bad is stress for the brain and your decision-making? How great is mindfulness? What's the research on it? So, I like to make the analogy that it was similar to comparing going to the gym and having your trainer work out with you versus going to the gym and your trainer telling you how great working out is. As you could predict, the working out is the key and really had the benefits. So, but that was useful because that meant that people that want to just read a book and think about mindfulness will not benefit. In fact, the group that got the didactic version looked no different than getting no training at all.
Yeah, I think about this with, you used a great metaphor with exercise. We've used that one here in this podcast before. Lynette Montero and Jane Compson, and one of their responses to mindful critics about, this is like exercise. And those are very good analogies. I often think about eating. Or you get full eating a meal or looking at it and talking about it. No, you actually have to partake in this. Just like you need to do the exercise, you need to do the practice. Right. And it's not saying that having an understanding, the didactic portion of it, that learning, is bad. It's just not helpful in the way that we're looking for this to be helpful.
Right. And it's how much time you need to get the framing and the conceptual understanding of what we're even talking about, right? I think that is important, but it may not require as much time as the actual practices.
Right. Now, you also brought up that you were doing comparisons of different doses of mindfulness practice. And I'm curious about how that went. What did you find out with that? And was there an impact that you were able to measure? You may not have been able to on just trainer competencies, which you and I have discussed before.
Yeah. So the interesting thing was I thought, okay, that's great that 8 hours is helpful of a practice-focused program, because that's when the commanders are willing to at least say, okay, we'll give this a try. But I fully expected that 16 and 24 might result in more benefits, right? So the more, the better in some sense, just like the physical fitness analogy. But in fact, what we found was that the 16 and 24-hour variance didn't actually result in anything that looked all that different than the 8 hours. So that was also kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Because you might kind of max out, especially in this high, just to make a very strong caveat, this is all in the context of a very high stress period of time in these people's lives. So even if you're sitting in class and for 24 hours, it just may not make a dent in the rest of your life. or it makes a dent equivalent to getting 8 hours of time, right? So on the one hand, it looked like more time for the formal training didn't mean bigger benefit. On the other hand, when we look at individuals, so even in the shorter form training programs, like these 8 hour, 4 to 8 week programs, at an individual level, the more time people spend individually practicing exercises, the more they benefit. And that to me is, it feels a little bit contradictory, but it actually isn't. So we did this study recently, to switch gears slightly, with the University of Miami football team. And we worked with them in, again, a high stress, high performance context. It was the last month prior to them leading up to their playing season, their athletic competition season. If we did nothing at all, they declined in their performance. Again, attention, working memory, and mood. But those that took the short form training program and practiced actually benefited more than those who didn't. And the title of the paper is it's all about practice. So that's I think that was the first part of what you're asking is, what happens with these other variants? Basically, the bottom line is, to benefit, you need to practice. And the more you do, the more you benefit. I was going to say the second part is really, okay, great. So now if you can have a short form program that's accessible, can fit within most high demand group schedules, how do you scale up the delivery of this? How do you find and create a training core so that there's qualified trainers that can do this? And that is a big puzzle. I think that's a big puzzle in the larger landscape of offering mindfulness training. We want programs that have some type of scientific basis, that these are effective and have tractable benefits. But then we want trainers that can deliver those programs effectively. And then we weren't sure how to go. We just knew that if we have short form training programs, and now we don't have 200 soldiers we want to train, but 100,000 soldiers, it cannot be one trainer that does that. List down.
How do you scale?
But yeah, she cannot train, that many people. For me, it was really like a matter of, what are the existing resources that these organizations already have for people that would want to be trainers? Instead of always thinking of us bringing in trainers from the outside, how about benefiting from people that already know the community, that know their challenges, that could organically have a discussion about how to integrate them within the community's life? So, for example, back to the football project, my graduate student was a football player. So he just kind of knew the landscape. And when we created the program, he knew how to go in a direction that could really speak to them. Same thing with one of my colleagues, Scott Rogers. He's a lawyer himself, and he's our main training expert. But he knows how to craft programs for lawyers and judges and law students. Mm-hmm. So I already have this sense that if we partner with the organization and have them tell us who would be the best likely, the most successful trainers that they have ready access to, we would probably be in good shape. But I was kind of nervous to just have that be the only kind of trainer. So I thought, let's go to the civilian context. And what are the most what group has the highest standards and best practices for developing trainers? And from my mind, that was MBSR certification. So let's get trainers that are MBSR certified. We know they've gone through very rigorous, years and years of training, as you know, and let's have them be another cadre of trainers. So we trained one of our collaborators is an MBSR teacher, and we had him learn our program. This was a program called Mindfulness-Based Attention Training, or MBAT, that we developed for soldiers specifically with Scott Rogers. And he learned the program. We also had a group of Army sports psychologists who knew how to train soldiers, but knew nothing about mindfulness. So we spent about 10 weeks, which many of my, wonderful senior teacher colleagues gasp when I say 10 weeks, that's nothing. But we wanted them to have a foundational understanding of mindfulness, akin to if they took an MBSR course, for example. Mm-hmm. So after they did that, then they learned how to deliver the training. Then we put them head to head. What happens now when you've got a trainer that's MBSR certified, knows our program, and trainers that are Army sports psychologists, learned about mindfulness themselves, and now know about how to deliver this program? What happens when they deliver to soldiers? And what we found, which was a little bit surprising, we also had a group of soldiers that didn't have any training. So that group did what we always see, unfortunately. Pre-deployment, high stress, degradation in attention and working memory and mood. But now when we compare these other two trainers, I thought to myself, either way, it's a win, because now we have a way forward, whether it's going to be calling up the Center for Mindfulness and saying, give us your trainers. We need to train, other military service members. Or if it was going to be saying to the Army, we can train your guys to do it. It was going to be a win. So that's a great position to be in as a scientist, just as an aside, is set it up so that it's a win no matter what you find. But I was curious to see what would happen. And what we ended up finding is that the better trainer, meaning the one that had a bigger impact on benefiting soldiers' performance, was the Army trainer. And when we talked to the MBSR instructor, he was not surprised by this at all. He's like, look, I know this program and I know mindfulness. It's new for me to try to deliver mindfulness to a group of people that aren't coming to it on their own, right? They're being offered it through their profession. And it's new for me to deal with service members. I don't know this culture. I don't know this community. Doesn't mean that if we had given him another year crash course in understanding military culture, he may have also benefited, in the end may have benefited, but we didn't have that opportunity. So in the end, what we found is that the context familiar trainer, even if they were naive to mindfulness at the outset, really does seem to be the kind of trainer we want to cultivate for scalable delivery.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned context earlier as well, that first off, what you're saying, that the person who is they're within the same group, essentially, as the people who are participants in this course. I would suggest that maybe because they have a greater personal connection and understanding. And I think about the difference between someone at the Center for Mindfulness, or when I am teaching MBSR, I do it in a very different way with a particular group of people, a cohort we may have, versus how I've seen Liz Stanley just do presentations on this, because Liz has a military background, and it shows in how they present.
Well, let me just make a couple of, I think you're right. I think that that's one thing that we thought would definitely have an impact. But the thing to keep in mind is that these trainers, they weren't actually service members themselves. They're sports psychologists who have been trained to train soldiers. So in some sense, they're at a distance. I mean, they're not, they haven't been there. And some of them may have, but most of them have not actually been in combat, but they definitely know the ins and outs of how to best prepare soldiers. And the contextualizing is definitely different. And this program is actually distinct from Liz Stanley's program, just to make that kind of clarification, is that MBAT is actually something that we've collaborated very heavily with active duty service members, a whole host of them, including colonels and generals, to actually create a program. And actually Sharon Salzberg and John Kabat-Zinn are also part of our advisory group to create this very accessible program that we think may resonate when delivered by the right kind of trainer.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, that one doesn't necessarily need to be within that group, as long as one knows how to be with that group and train and meet their particular needs.
Right. And it's very interesting. It's sort of like there's a whole interesting sociological aspect to this. In some sense, an in-group, a particular group likes it when somewhat of an outsider is coming in, because they're like, oh, this person knows something more than I know, because they're not me. They're not like my fellow soldiers. They know something more, but they know what it's like to be me. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like this, not exactly them, different than them, but close enough, right, or know it in the right way.
So something else I wanted to get into is that this also talks to some of the difficulties in doing this work, the real world moving parts, some of what we're talking about. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what some of those challenges have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is remember, back to my kind of personal history. I was trained as a basic scientist. I'm not a clinician. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training. I was very comfortable with a lot of control in the experimental design, the laboratory setting, where you know everything, you know your parameters, and you move in very small increments to do the research, right? So highly controlled context. And to go from that kind of context to, okay, the team's going to be deployed to a military base on the other coast to conduct research on this topic. I mean, it's a very big leap. And I think that a lot of people don't understand. I think clinicians probably understand this well, because they know what it's like to kind of have to work with samples that aren't clean laboratory specimens. I mean, they're actual humans actually living their lives, and they're suffering. And we're trying to help people that are suffering. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to. But I would say that the challenge in all of this, is that first, just to back up a little bit more and say, it's always challenging to conduct research. you've got to convince some body that they should, body of people or an individual, to help pay for the research, right? So you write the grant, so you ask the philanthropist to fund you to do the work. After you have the money, you still have to go convince the people that may potentially give you access to the community you want to work with to give you access. That is not trivial. I mean, Liz and I probably spent a year going around and briefing different commanders before we found one leader willing to take us in. And that was after having the funding to do the research. So, those are big hurdles. And then, of course, it's making the case to each individual soldier, him or herself, that this may be worthy of their time, at least to consider that it may be worthy of the time. All those things need to happen even before you think about conducting a study. So, at some level, I'm so pleased that our work is showing us some direction and fruitful ways to move the science forward. There's another part of me that's just like shocked that we ever find anything, given what we're trying to do. Because it is very, very tricky, and we have to build on past evidence to grow it further. But it's not the same as going to your local clinic or getting a bunch of undergrads to come to your lab to do research. There's a lot of other cases that have to be made and convincing that has to be done before you can even think about starting the research itself.
And I think this touches upon the last topic we'll talk about today, which is this value of communicating to the public, how difficult that can be. And it's one of the reasons this podcast was started, and finding value in having the discussion not just be between scientist to scientist, but to the general public, I think may help answer some of this awareness and the misperceptions. One of the things that comes up quite frequently is the mindful sniper criticism of helping people who are suffering in a military context. I'm wondering if you could just share some of your thoughts on that.
I mean, to me, it's such an important issue, and I feel pretty strongly. I mean, I'm definitely on one end of the spectrum of how I feel about scientists' responsibility to communicate to the public. I mean, I actually think it should be required from any federal funding source that scientists have the responsibility to communicate back. I mean, we live off the sort of fat of the land, so to speak. We don't get federal funds to do work unless somebody thought that it was worthy of pursuing. So it's our responsibility, from my point of view, to communicate it back. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for misunderstanding of what we're trying to achieve, what my particular motivation is, even with regard to the military work that we're talking about, right? And having those conversations publicly to the broad public, as well as to actual other mindfulness practitioners and community leaders, to say, why would you want to do this? Why would you want to bring these peaceful, peace-promoting practices to people that have the authority to kill as part of their job description? And I guess, I mean, this isn't specifically what you were asking, but I'm just going to take my opportunity to say that, from my point of view, if you have somebody who has literally the access to kill hundreds of people with the weapons that they hold, why wouldn't you want them to be fully able to have access to all of their attention, to act responsibly? That's the goal. And when the reason I'm so attracted in some sense to have my research intersect with these real world high pressure performers is because they're the ones that are the cornerstone of more suffering or less suffering. So helping them will, I think, help us all be better able to maneuver through very difficult circumstances.
Thank you. Well, for those of you who are interested in finding out more, you can go to Amishi's website, amishi.com. And I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Probably a few other things as well, maybe some of the papers we've talked about. Amishi, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. And thanks for doing this podcast to do exactly what we just talked about, having a real complex conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.